SISE, the 5th day. Been a wonderful week. Just to review, Monday we talked about the high-level picture of decarbonization, the need, the status, and the outlook. Tuesday we talked about the new energy economy with Chris Gould and a UN study of the Midwest. On Wednesday, tools for change, both in Chicago and at the national perspective. MK Dorsey as the keynoter. Yesterday it was social impact startups and entrepreneurs, and today we're going to wind up with a focus on the US-Canada energy challenges and the SISE ecosystem map that the fellows had been working on actually even before SISE started on Monday officially. So first up will be Rachel McCormick, who will give us the concluding keynote for the day and for SISE. She's the Consul General of Canada to the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, and she's actually, her home base is Dallas. She was the head of the Energy Environment section of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. from 2014 to 2019. And she joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2004 in Ottawa. And she worked in divisions responsible for sustainable development, energy, climate change, and circumpolar affairs. So she is very well informed and has a wonderfully grounded perspective on energy and environment. And Rachel, oh, can I ask, we were talking earlier with Rachel and she had an interesting story about her education, which just absolutely aligns with what SISE thinks about critical thinking and what we've been talking about all week for critical thinking. So Rachel, if you'd say a little bit about yourself to more than I did as you start, that would be great.
Great. Well, first off, thank you so much, George, for welcoming me. I know that our office in Chicago has a really long and productive relationship with the Institute, and it's one we value, the Government of Canada values. And to all the fellows, no matter where you land, we have a strong network of consulates and embassies around the world, and we look forward to connecting with you again. We anticipate that you're going to be doing great things having joined this program. A little bit about what we were talking, George was mentioning, the intersection between the economy and sustainability has really been my passion for since I left high school, to be quite honest, from undergrad. This might age me a little bit, but the environmental science program I did, you could do a second major. And you could choose from biology, chemistry, geography, and economics. And I was only the second person ever to choose economics. And people would ask me, like, what does the economy have to do with environmental science? And at that point I was saying, you know, what doesn't it have to do with environmental science? And I'm so glad that now that sort of integration is just so obvious and that studies are really focusing on that. And when I went on to grad school, I actually chose my grad school based on the fact that went to the University of Calgary for both the master's and the PhD programs. It required what was called an intervention component. So when you finish your thesis or your dissertation, you had to have an extra chapter at the end that talked about how do you solve this in the real world, not just from an academic sense. What are the practical applications? So who are the actors that can affect change? And what are the barriers to their progress based on your research? So that was really important to me. And it was also important to me that the conversations were interdisciplinary. So you worked across fields. And on my dissertation committee, I had a lawyer, an economist, somebody from the MBA program, and a scientist. So just a little bit more background there for me. I know that this week wasn't exactly the way that you anticipated, you know, meeting FaceTime to FaceTime instead of face-to-face. And I hope that in a future iteration of this, you'll be able to get together and have drinks and discuss these ideas and enjoy the food and architecture of Chicago. That's something I look forward to as well. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, in the backdrop of a global pandemic, as well as, of course, the fight for racial equity and human rights around the globe, and the significant challenge of climate change, how we might be thinking about in Canada approaching specifically the issue of climate change, but also touching on some of these other aspects. We know that big challenges require collaborative and inclusive approaches, and I know that you've been talking about that all week. So I think I'm going to be building a lot on what you spoke about throughout the week and I know you had a lot of excellent keynotes who I've had the pleasure of spending time with in the past that have big ideas and aren't at all scared to take on complex challenges. Just to start, I wanted to say that I think we recognize, the Government of Canada really recognizes the importance of collaboration amongst different levels of government. In Canada, we work very closely with our provinces. We have shared jurisdiction over a lot of things that relate to the energy sector, the environment, water, the economy. But we also work really collaboratively with industry, thought leaders, and of course, we have to work together as countries. And so we are actually very committed to a strong multilateral approach to global issues, whether it's the pandemic or climate change. We are committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. We are leading the charge internationally on the issue of plastic pollution, having launched a plastics charter during our G7 chairship. And we're actually hosting the World Circular Economy Forum next year. It's supposed to be this year, delayed. And we're working both domestically and internationally on the issue of biodiversity. For example, we surpassed our goal of 10% of our oceans being protected in Canada, and this week joined the Global Ocean Alliance to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. We are also very committed to rules-based free trade. We are the only G7 country to have a free trade agreement with all G7 countries. And we also, of course, have an agreement with the Pacific market in Europe. And on July 1st, which was Canada Day, we saw a modernized NAFTA come into effect with the United States, Canada, Mexico-Canada agreement. It has a different name, depending on which country you come from, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Another very strong basis to our approach is fact and science-based decision-making. Now let me speak just for a bit about one of the challenges in Canada, which, depending on how you look at it, is also actually an amazing opportunity. We have a vast and diversified portfolio of energy resources, both renewable and hydrocarbon-based. To take advantage of this endowment, we see the benefit. We produce large quantities of energy, both for domestic consumption and also for export. It's a large part of our GDP, and it also provides a lot of jobs. But at the same time, we understand the importance of acting on climate change. We understand that the economic impacts of climate change could reach as much as $43 billion a year in the next 20 years in Canada. So we know we have to work to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Our oil and gas resources make it a very attractive investment place for continuing development and production. But we know we have to ensure how we develop those projects is consistent with our commitment to climate change as well as engaging our local communities. You might be surprised about this, but we actually have over 80% of our electricity from renewable energy. And our goal is actually to expand that to 90% by 2030. And about 17% of our total primary energy supply right now is from renewable sources. So how are we acting on climate change in Canada? We have something that's called the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And it was developed in consultation with the provinces and the territories of Canada, as well as with the Indigenous peoples and industry. And it has a number of pillars within it that really help us address where our challenges are. A lot of our emissions come from the transportation and the industrial sector, but also from buildings. So those are the areas that we know we have to focus on. Interestingly though, if you think about it, framework on clean growth and climate change. So it really, from the very beginning, talked about the intersection with the economy and investment and innovation. And that has been a very consistent connection for the Government of Canada throughout the time that the Trudeau government has been in place. There's always very, very much a focus on both the economy and the environment together. The potential for jobs, the potential for growth, the recognition of the huge global market that is being created for clean tech, and the role that Canada could play in leading that, and also the opportunities that are there for our businesses. I want to focus in on one pillar of the Pan-Canadian Framework, which is pricing carbon pollution. Why do we do that? It provides an incentive to change behavior, to innovate, to reduce the waste of a valuable resource, and then, of course, reduce our emissions. We currently have a price of carbon at $30 a ton, but I want to say before I get into it that we actually had pricing on carbon since 2007, and it started at the provincial level. I can't stress enough the role that the provinces play in this regard. Leaderships in the provinces saw a carbon tax in place in Alberta, in British Columbia, a levy in Alberta, and a cap and trade system in Quebec, which is actually linked to California. When the Trudeau government came into power, they ran on a platform that they would have a price on carbon across Canada. And in doing that, in 2019, they put in place two elements. One, a price on fuel, and second, an output-based pricing system for large facilities. So provinces had an option to use the federal system or use their own system, and there's a variety across the country right now. The price started at $20 and it increases $10 a year until it hits $50, at which point we will do an assessment on next steps. In addition to pricing pollution, we're doing a lot of other things, including for energy efficiency, clean transportations, and regulations to meet our goal of reducing methane emissions by 45% by 2025. But alongside all of these efforts was an investment, $2 billion through a low carbon economy fund. And that fund is used to invest in projects to reduce emissions across the country, but also to improve resiliency. And actually, it was really important that the investment was actually half-half. It was about improving resiliency and reducing emissions to make sure that our country and our communities and our companies were ready for the future. We knew that clean technology was a really important place to invest. We created a lot of innovation and growth by investing in low carbon challenges, for example, and I think you'll hear more about that later, and also thinking about how to partner with industry on really important things like carbon capture. So now let's get to the heart of the challenge I spoke about. We're rich in resources. We're committed to taking action on climate change. So what does the energy system of the future look like when a lot of our jobs depend on hydrocarbons? So at the same time as we developed that pan-Canadian framework on climate change, clean growth and climate change, we did a process called Generation Energy. We talked to Canadians, we talked to industry, we talked about what our energy system of the future is going to look like. And at the end of it all, it came down to 4 themes: cleaner oil and gas, higher efficiency, clean power, and renewable fuels. And I just want to take a minute before we wrap up on the idea of cleaner oil and gas. You've likely heard all about Canada's oil sands. But what you may not be aware of is that through innovation, the per barrel emissions of our oil sands have actually decreased 24% since 2012. We have new technologies coming that project another decrease of 17 to 26% by 2030. So think about that. Essentially a 50% reduction in less than 20 years. And many of the operators in the oil sands have a commitment to being net zero by 2050. Another important thing to think about is that in the oil sands, we have a really huge monitoring program. It's actually the largest publicly available, transparent environmental monitoring system in the world on water, air emissions, et cetera. And it allows the community, allows any one of you to look and see what the emissions or water issues are at any day, any point in time. Another really great example of that intersection of energy and environment for the future is a project on Canada's west coast. We'll see the world's cleanest large LNG export facility being built. That's as a result of both technology and having fully a baseload of renewable energy powering it. That's not to say that we are only focusing on oil and gas. As I mentioned, we're talking about clean energy as well. I mentioned before that we have a 90% clean electricity goal and also a focus on increasing the electrification of industry, given our richness in terms of renewable energy. But I wanted to have, perhaps provocatively, note that given the significant roles that hydrocarbons play in economies around the world, efforts to reduce their emissions in short and medium, possibly long term, are actually indeed important. I also want to talk about the importance of us being inclusive when we're talking about energy systems. And that's why Canada decided to be a co-lead for a program called Equal by 30, which is trying to advance the participation of women in the clean energy transition. At home, we're working really hard to ensure strong consultations with Indigenous communities in the context of resource development, and also to ensure those communities are part of an investment strategy for energy transitions and building resilience to climate change. These are incredibly challenging times. I'm sure that you have heard the words unprecedented many times this week, but that means we're all in a position of having to work hard, having to work smarter. But I did get a chance to look at your resumes, and I'm pretty confident that you're going to be the people that we need to take on these challenges. And so before we get into the Q&A, and I'm excited to hear your questions and your thoughts, I just want to give you my sincere congratulations to all of you for nearly completing your program. And I'm sure we're going to be able to count yourselves amongst world changers that affect change in the future. So kudos to you all and look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful. We do have time for questions. Fellows, are there questions? You can signal us on chat. Let's see. I think,
George, if it's okay with you, can I ask a question?
of course, please.
So my question, Rachel, is about Canada's electricity markets are deregulated, right? The provinces can decide on the generation, transmission, distribution, which is obviously, advantageous because there's that local knowledge aspect, but obviously a bit harder when you're thinking about how do we export power from the prairies to the demand centers on the coasts. I was just sort of wondering on how the Canadian government's thinking about how it's going to evolve over the next couple of decades, because obviously you can either go to a fully centralized approach of we're going to have these massive wind farms, or you can go to the opposite, the distributed microgrid systems. And either way works. It's just sort of a value judgment. And to do the centralized model, you need to improve that transmission capacity, which is not really possible right now because of the separate decision-making structures.
Sorry, and really quick, that was Nathaniel, right?
Yes, sure, Thomas.
I just want to make sure Rachel knows Nathaniel is our resident Canadian in the program, so.
Thanks for the question. It's a really important one. So it's interesting, when you look at, so I didn't put this, didn't say this before, but when you look at the energy system of North America, it's highly integrated. And maybe you've talked about this already, but we have over 70 pipelines and over 30 transmission lines that actually mostly run north-south. So if you look at the map, there's as much integration north-south as there is east-west. And so it is really a conversation that is important to have across borders as well, but also across internal borders, because we don't have a lot of connections between our provinces. Provinces are the equivalent of states in Canada. Electricity is actually under provincial jurisdiction, so we collaborate with the U.S. through what's called NERC. So the United States has FERC, and each of our provinces have their own electricity governance situations. And so the 10 provinces and FERC together make the North American Electricity Reliability Council. And they work together on everything from cyber to reliability standards, et cetera. And so I think we're looking at transitioning. There's a few important things. I want to just flag a really great project that I always like to talk about as maybe the poster child of that sort of north-south transmission in terms of energy transition. And that's a project that says transmission of clean baseload hydropower down to Minnesota from Manitoba. That's allowed coal power to be backed out, but also maintain baseload for a company. And it was a collaboration between Minnesota Power and Manitoba Power, Manitoba Hydro, with a long-term investment to build a transmission line that is allowing that transition to take place. So that's just a really great project about collaboration amongst different districts. Lots of conversation within Canada about that type of collaboration. So some provinces like Quebec are pretty much 100% hydropower, same with Manitoba, where other provinces are more reliant on fossil fuel-based electricity. So all of those things are really important to think about as we're investing in different systems. Microgrids, localized energy are going to be important. We're also thinking about small modular reactors. In Canada, we have released what's called a small modular reactor roadmap. And we are going to, this fall, be releasing an action plan in terms of implementation on that. But what it found was that those small modular reactors can be really important zero emission baseload for industry, especially remote industry. Secondly, for communities, remote communities that right now perhaps are on diesel, which is not good really from an economy or environment perspective. And then finally for sort of general electricity transmission. But really in terms of the electrification of industry, there's a huge potential there. So I think it's not, definitely not a one or the other approach. And it's important for us to think about where the needs are differently across districts in Canada.
Great answer. And Suzanne, I think you had a question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for sharing with us, Rachel, all the strong environmental and social policy that the Canadian government has implemented. And I could see a lot of commitment from a governmental level. And that's very different from what we see here in the US. Did I freeze? I froze. No?
We can still hear you. We can hear
Oh,
you.
okay, good. Okay, I'm sorry. So that's very different from what we see here in the United States. And I was wondering if you could name one challenge that the United States have to overcome, or one main action or one main change that needs to be done in these countries so we can follow a similar path?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's some other questions on the chat sort of about the Canada-US cooperation and issues there. You know, our collaboration with the United States is very deep and varied. We have worked with the US on technologies across different things. So whether it's CCUS or oil and gas, energy efficiency standard, we have aligned energy efficiency standards for appliances in many ways. And so when we talk with the US, we also collaborate with states. And so we have there's a North American Climate Partnership, which sees Canada, Mexico, and a number of the states that are working towards a 2030 goal, working together on things like, and I saw some mention about electric vehicles in the chat as well. So we're talking about movement to zero emission vehicles. How do small states, provinces with small populations transition to electric vehicles? And we're sharing information and best practices on that. And we're investing in that infrastructure in Canada as well. Obviously, in terms of things like methane reduction, that's a challenge across North America. And so sharing information on that, that's a shared challenge. And, you know, some areas that perhaps might not come to mind immediately. Aaron, who you'll have a great chance to collaborate with and listen to in the panel, and I were part of an organization of a great discussion at the Canadian Embassy last year on collaboration on artificial intelligence and advanced materials in the energy and industrial sector. And those things can be really important for optimizing operations and reducing emissions. So I think, you know, it's, although policy goals may have a different slant, there's still a lot of concrete action that we're doing collaboratively with Canada and the US.
Great answer, Rachel. Thanks so much. We have time for one more fast question. And Karen, you had an interesting question about oil and gas demand.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. My question was, you talked a lot about the innovation to make a lot of the oil and gas facilities cleaner and more efficient, but has the Pan-Canadian framework considered the impact of like falling demand for oil and gas as we transition to EVs? And have you like begun to work with industry to plan ahead for that reduced production and a transition of workers away from the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, so you know, it's interesting you use the word transition with workers, and I think that's really important. And when we were the chair of the G7, it was the first time we had the term just transition included in a communique for the G7, and I think that really speaks to that idea. And so we had a task force on just transition that was taken across Canada, and it was actually the head of our labor union, Labor Council in Canada, that had those conversations across Canada, thinking about like, so what happens, how do we, for example, take Boilermakers, how do they transition into the clean energy economy? Where are those skills going to be needed? So it was a really important discussion. Not that there wasn't hard conversations, and there will be, but definitely that's part of the conversation in terms of how do we transition as we're thinking about a clean energy economy. That's part of the dialogue.